The McL40 began the 2026 season with a decent baseline, but it lacked outright pace when measured against the front of the grid. From the opening rounds, drivers flagged inconsistency in the car's balance, along with a nervous rear end that showed up under load through medium and high-speed corners. This was not a hidden problem restricted to internal telemetry. It was visible session after session, in qualifying and in race trim, and it shaped how conservatively the car had to be driven through the first half of the year. A car that cannot be trusted at the limit forces its drivers to leave performance on the table simply to protect against a sudden loss of rear grip, and that is precisely the compromise McLaren's drivers were working around in the early rounds of 2026. A significant part of the issue traced back to weight, a recurring problem across the entire grid under the current regulation set. New technical regulations frequently push cars over their intended weight targets in year one, as teams build in structural margin before they fully understand how the new rules behave under load. McLaren prioritized hitting the minimum weight limit by race 1, which it achieved, but that achievement came at a cost. Development time and resources that could otherwise have gone toward pure performance gains were redirected into weight-saving work instead, meaning that in the opening months of the season, engineering hours were spent removing grams from the car rather than adding lap time to it. This is a trade-off every competitive team on the grid has had to negotiate this season, because sitting comfortably below the weight limit carries its own separate penalty. Teams that undercut the minimum weight by a wide margin are forced to sacrifice components or structural rigidity elsewhere on the car, since a lighter car must then be brought back up to the legal minimum through ballast, and ballast placed purely to make weight, rather than to fine-tune weight distribution, is dead weight in the worst possible sense. The target for every serious constructor, therefore, is not to be as light as possible, but to land at or just under the limit and use ballast placement deliberately, as a balance tool rather than a correction. McLaren met the race 1 weight target early in the year, but the resource cost of doing so is visible in how the car's on-track pace evolved, and struggled to evolve, across the opening months of the campaign. What made the McL40's early season character even harder to diagnose is that it carried behavioral traits over from last year's car, despite racing under a completely different regulation set with a different aerodynamic philosophy underpinning it. The nervous rear end, and the specific manner in which the car behaved once pushed to the limit, were not new phenomena for McLaren. Drivers and engineers alike noted the resemblance to the previous car's characteristics, even though almost nothing about the underlying regulations connects one car to the other. McLaren itself has not been able to fully explain why these traits persisted through a complete regulation reset that, on paper, should have given the team a clean technical slate. The team's own internal assessment points to this being a team-level development signature, rather than something tied to a specific chassis concept, aerodynamic package, or suspension geometry carried over between the two cars. This is not a phenomenon unique to McLaren, and it is worth placing in a wider context. Across Formula One history, teams have carried philosophical fingerprints across regulation cycles that reset the technical rulebook almost entirely. Certain outfits have historically excelled at specific circuit characteristics, low speed, high downforce street circuits, for example, or fast, flowing layouts, regardless of which generation of chassis they happen to be racing that year. That pattern suggests development culture, internal simulation tools, and long-standing technical philosophy persist inside a team even when the regulations governing the car change completely underneath it. McLaren's carried-over rear-end nervousness appears to fit that broader historical pattern. The practical consequence is that a full regulation reset does not automatically erase a team's inherited strengths or weaknesses, since the people, the simulation models, and the design instincts that shaped the previous car remain largely in place when the new one is built. For McLaren specifically, this meant that solving the McL40's issues could not be treated as a simple carryover correction from the previous season's fix. A team-level signature, by definition, is not isolated to one component or one system. It is distributed across the way the car is conceived from the earliest stages of design. That is part of why the team's engineers have been cautious about declaring the problem solved even after a positive result, since a trait rooted in development philosophy tends to resurface in new forms rather than disappearing after a single update. The technical fix that began to address these problems arrived at the 2026 Hungarian Grand Prix, and it centered on the floor and the rear-end detail of the car, the two areas most directly connected to the complaints raised throughout the first half of the season. This upgrade has since been corroborated by outside technical reporting, which confirmed that McLaren brought a redesigned floor along with additional aerodynamic parts to Hungary, marking its first major update package since the Canadian Grand Prix. The gap between those two events represents a substantial stretch of the calendar during which McLaren raced largely without significant aerodynamic development, concentrating instead on the weight-saving work described earlier. The team itself described the Hungary update as closing a gap it admitted was 3 months behind rival development, a rare and specific quantified admission of exactly where the car stood relative to the competition at that stage of the season. Rather than a vague acknowledgement of underperformance, the floor itself carried several distinct, specific technical changes rather than a single broad revision. It featured an extended vertical outer edge running the floor's perimeter, a modification aimed at controlling and sealing airflow along the car's most sensitive aerodynamic surface, where even small losses of sealing translate directly into lost downforce. Internally, the floor's structure was built around an internal cage structure feeding 3 outflow slots, and this internal architecture, not just the visible outer surface, was revised specifically as part of the Hungary update. The floor surface itself was also deliberately sculpted to better separate turbulence control zones from one another, preventing airflow disturbed in one region of the floor from contaminating a neighboring zone that needs to remain clean. This is best described as microaerodynamic work, low in visual impact when viewed from outside the car, but significant in terms of how it shapes the airflow traveling underneath it at racing speed. The second focus area of the Hungary update was the rear brake intake region, a part of the car that interacts directly with the floor's low-pressure zone at the rear of the diffuser. Here, the duct, the suspension components, and the surrounding bodywork were engineered to work together to redirect lateral turbulence away from that low-pressure area. Mclaren split this zone into 3 parts to stabilize flow and cut the risk of flow separation, a change that directly targeted the inconsistency drivers had been raising publicly since the opening races of the season. Flow separation at the rear of the car is precisely the kind of unpredictable event that produces the sudden loss of rear grip drivers had described, a symptom, not a coincidence, of the underlying aerodynamic instability the team was working to correct. The combined result of these floor and rear end changes was a better fed diffuser and a more predictable, efficient rear end, addressing, at a measurable technical level, the 2 complaints that had defined the McL40's reputation since testing. There was also a downstream effect that extended beyond raw aerodynamic performance figures. The update gave the team a clearer understanding of tire warm-up and cooling behavior at the rear axle, information that is now feeding directly into how the team is sequencing its remaining development items through the rest of the season, rather than developing each new part in isolation. Tire behavior and aerodynamic flow are closely linked at the rear of a modern Formula One car, since the same airflow that stabilizes the diffuser also passes close to the rear tire's operating surface and influences how quickly the tire reaches its working temperature window. A rear end that sheds turbulence unpredictably, as the McL40 did before Hungary, makes it correspondingly harder to predict how the rear tires will behave from one lap to the next. By stabilizing the airflow in that region, the Hungary update appears to have also stabilized a second, related variable, tire behavior, that had been compounding the car's balance issues rather than existing separately from them. The outcome of this package is where the story moves from technical detail to measurable, on-track result. Lando Norris took his first pole position of 2026 in Hungary and converted it into his first win of the season, a result that arrived directly off the back of the floor and rear-end update. Oscar Piastri ran competitively before retiring, which meant the update's benefit was not isolated to a single car on the grid, but appeared to translate across both McL40 chassis in the same session. McLaren's own team principal has attributed this step directly to the upgrade package brought to Hungary. A rival technical figure at Mercedes has publicly floated an alternate explanation for the result, one that McLaren disputes. This should be understood as a live technical disagreement within the paddock rather than a settled technical question, and it illustrates how difficult it can be, even for experienced rival engineers working from limited outside data, to isolate the exact source of a single weekend's competitive step. Despite this step forward, the McL40 has not become an easy car to drive, and that qualification matters for understanding the second half of the season. McLaren's own personnel continue to describe the car as difficult to handle at the limit, and outside technical reporting has independently described the car's limit behavior as unpredictable. This is an important distinction for assessing where the team actually stands after Hungary. The Hungarian result should not be overread as a full turnaround in the car's underlying characteristics. It represented a favorable characteristic match between the upgraded package and that specific circuit layout, not proof that the underlying handling deficit has been fully solved across every type of track on the calendar. McLaren's own technical leadership has since confirmed this directly. Driver feedback continues to show that the car is difficult to extract lap time from consistently, and that development is now being targeted specifically at drivability rather than simply adding more downforce. That represents a meaningful shift in engineering priority. Adding downforce is, in relative terms, a more straightforward technical problem to solve than fixing how a car behaves at the edge of grip across a range of different corner types, track surfaces, and tire conditions. Choosing to chase drivability instead of raw aerodynamic load signals that McLaren views the car's